This administration is running like a fine-tuned machine.
Oh my God, they've got a madman on their hands.
Podcasting from a secret location deep inside the political colossus. This is Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
We will have no truce nor parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America. This is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I've got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the walls.
We're going to hold on to him by the nose, and we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose.
This is Radio Free GOP with your host, Mike Murphy.
Donald Trump folds like a cheap suit. Republicans breathe a little easier. Coffee King Howard Schultz feels the real boiling heat. And the comrades win a big one in New York City as Amazon runs for the city line. We're talking about all that and an interview with my old friend from the Reagan White House days, the one and only Frank Lavin. It's all here at the corner of Republican resistance and political rage. Radio Free GOP. Let's get right to it.
He got the election wrong, so what's he doing back? When the president's a crazy man, you gotta talk some smack. Radio Free GOP.
So a lot of news going on, a lot of things to talk about. First of all, the obvious one, President Trump signed the deal to keep the government open. He does have a learning curve. He learned that you don't want to go play poker with Riverboat Pelosi when he ain't got no card. You would have thought he would have known that going in. Plenty of people warned him, but he didn't. So he reluctantly has skedaddled over to sign the bill to extend the funding. Now, because Trump has to be the hero, of course, of any story he's part of, he's going the national emergency route. We'll see if that's just optics or if he's really going to try something with the federal budget or raid the Corps of Engineers or whatever he might try to do to go build the wall with off-the-books money, setting a terrible precedent, by the way, which is legally pretty weak and probably won't happen. But anyway, that's going to be his PR thing. He's going to declare victory. But the Snickers are out there because the reality is he did fold through his own clumsiness. And all of this, I think, gets at the biggest political problem he's going to have, which is he was elected as this art of the deal guy. I mean, he fired Gilbert Gottfried. You know, he's Mr. Can-Do, Mr. Negotiator, and he hasn't been able to negotiate a damn thing. So more kryptonite etching at his pretty tawdry Superman cape. We'll see where that goes. Now, this means the Republicans, of course, are putting down the Rolaids, which they buy by the metric ton now, because it looks like you won't go on another self-destructive government shutdown. The last one was painful, useless, and for no good purpose. And the Republican Party is losing what little patience it has for political disaster. The memory of the tumbleweeds rolling past all the empty seats in our once great House majority is still fresh in the minds of Republicans looking at the 2020 election, thinking, we can't lose everything. Are we going to lose everything? Is Trump going to lose everything? Because they know Donald Trump can't change. Most politicians get in trouble. They pivot. They listen. They adjust. They use the incredible power of the White House political operation and communications machine to change it up, sing a new number. Well, not Trump. He's the atomic clock of being Trump. So here we are. And I can tell you from the Republicans I talk to, they don't quite know what to do about it. Most are waiting for Mueller to see how bad that is. But they know they're on the railroad tracks to a really tough 2020. And in any political party, at the end, there's brutal pragmatism. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. The president's situation politically is not unlike our heroes in the original Star Wars when they're caught in the big garbage compactor and the walls are moving in. Takes some time, but it is a pretty dire situation. Now, there is, of course, one great rescue device for the Republican Party that we have thankfully relied on time and time again. And that, of course, is the Democrats. And the news is out now that Amazon has decided to run like hell away from New York City, having promised to bring 25,000 jobs there because some of the uber progressives in the local government around Long Island City think that 25,000 new jobs is a really, really bad idea. They were particularly offended by the subsidies that Amazon was going to get, which is, of course, richly ironic because I don't think many of those politicians have ever seen a subsidy or a government expenditure they weren't in love with. But apparently now subsidies are a bad deal. And look, I'll even meet them halfway on that. I'm a conservative. I don't really like subsidies, but occasionally they make some sense. The New York plan was linked to jobs created and was amortized over 10 years. And the payroll and economic power that Amazon would bring to the city, as a headquarters cluster. This is the thing you got to remember. We're not talking about a lawnmower factory here. Talking about putting a big, vital enterprise with a huge spend on services in the middle of a dense service hub of New York City. So ad agencies and other vendors would open up offices to serve the Amazon account. It's a 2 + 2 is 6 thing. But again, economic math is not the touchstone of the new left or the old left or any left. So Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, D/Che Guevara, won the day. And now hopefully a wonderful new intersectionalist poetry center can be opened. And of course, I'm sure that'll turn into 25,000 green jobs or whatever the current fantasy will be. I'm sure the Democratic bosses are berserk about this. They were all on board the Amazon thing because it was good for New York. And they do have a weapon, and I'm sure they're joking about it, maybe even thinking about it. This was mentioned in a smart, I believe, National Journal story. New York is going to lose 2 congressional districts due to the census, shrinking population. Again, let's strangle all the job creators and see what that does for population. But anyway, they're going to lose 2 congressional districts after the next redistricting, so it wouldn't be that hard for the big eraser to show up and vanish her district. Now, as emotionally satisfying as that would be, I think it's a dangerous ploy because she is very shrewd on social media. She represents real progressive energy, and she's crafty that way. I don't think she can govern her way out of a wet paper bag, not unlike the president, who she does have some parallels with in the shallowness of her pitch. But politically, in a Democratic primary in New York, she's the real deal. So she could wind up primarying somebody and taking their congressional district, or even, God forbid, and damn if I would not buy tickets to this, take on Chuck Schumer in the Democratic primary in 2022. That would be worth it. I'd get my mouse suit on and a big bag of popcorn and enjoy every minute of that. So I would tell the Democrats in New York, the machine guys and the bosses, careful, playing of nitroglycerin here. But we will indeed see what happens. I think the important thing about her is she does show how strong the leftist progressive economics energy is in the Democratic electorate, amplified by social media, which pulls off the miracle trick of putting a huge message in front of a lot of people, essentially for free. So it really, small d, democratizes political communication, but that's good for candidates who are strong on demagoguery and short on policy sophistication, like Ocasio-Cortez or Donald Trump. They are more alike than most people think. Trump adds a special level of villainy with his racist adjacent tendencies, but the techniques, the applause lines, the simplicity of it, the inherent hostility to any kind of sane government because you take positions that are both impossible and diametrically opposed and unworkable is the same. Now, the big presidential starting gun is fired. They're jumping in like crazy. We're going to have hundreds of them. I get a lot of people saying, well, who's going to win? And I said, what am I, Kreskin? How the hell do I know? I will make some predictions, though. Here's a little inside tip to handicapping a presidential primary race. Ignore the candidates at the beginning and focus on the voters, because the voters go shopping and they eventually find late in the primary process what they're looking for. The other reason to ignore the candidates is they look good on paper at the beginning, but they haven't been through the wind tunnel of actually running for president. I think my old buddy Axelrod calls it an electron microscope of the soul. Going through the journey shows the country, particularly Democratic primary voters, but all of us, a lot about who you are. So until they've been through that, they're kind of wet clumps of mud with potential. So let's quickly talk about the voters. I think there are 3 overlapping piles of voters in the Democratic primary, which, by the way, is over 30 million people who participated last time. I think it'll be higher this time. And because the Democrats all cried when old Yeller died, unlike us mean Republicans with our winner-take-all primaries, the Democratic process is mostly proportional, which means it goes on forever because everybody gets some delegates who finish in the top couple. So this thing will go on for a while, which means a lot of those 30 to 35 to 39 million primary voters will have a voice in what happened. So let's look for a second as we enter the Democratic primary season at the piles of vote. Now, these are overlapping, and this is oversimplified, but hell, it's a podcast, okay? This isn't the JFK school. The three dominant piles, in my view, are going to be identity liberalism, which is feminism and kind of who we are, minority communities, candidates of color, progressive economics, hello, Bernie and his ilk, and finally, a fairly new one, the characteristics of a fighter. Democrats are tired of being the wimpy political party while those crafty, evil Republicans with Dick Cheney and James Baker and the Koch brothers go out and steal everything and lie and cheat and steal. It's kind of a silly thing, believe it or not. We can barely organize a 4-car parade once in a while, but that's the perception, and perception is reality in politics. So they're shopping for some combination, or different sections of the party are looking for identity, liberal economics, progressive economics, as they would say, and a fighter. So then you throw that against the candidates, now only on paper, because we don't know yet. Kamala Harris, pretty impressive. California base, a fighter. Maybe she'll get better at it. I think she pulled out a big war hatchet that turned out to be made of styrofoam with some of the maneuvers in the Kavanaugh hearing. But still, I think she's going for a fighter, and she's going for identity. That's a pretty strong combination. She also seems to be moving toward progressive economics. That could be a trifecta. I think she is, at least in potential, a very strong candidate for the nomination. I think Trump is dreaming of running against her, but that's a question for Democrats to figure out. Cory Booker, I liked his video. I thought it was the best one so far because it was arguing from the point of view of we, not me, a kind of an overreaching message about uniting the country. It wasn't as identity focused as Kamala Harris's initial stuff was. Pretty shrewd. And the problem with Cory, who I know and like personally a bit, I think he's in it for all the right reasons. I think they all are, frankly. I don't think there's a stage villain among them. But Cory's kind of giggling enthusiasm may wear thin at the presidential level. We just don't know. We're going to find out. Elizabeth Warren, Washington's rolling their eyes, writing her off. She's too mean. Nobody likes her. Keeps tripping over the Native American stuff. Blah, blah, blah. All true, but you know what? I think she's a little underrated. She's got progressive economics, and she's a fighter. And she's smart, and she's famous in New Hampshire. That is pretty good rocket fuel. So I don't count Elizabeth Warren out, at least in her potential. Beto, we don't know. He's new. He's fresh. People love him. Don't think that, that's not enough to get you into the hunt in a presidential primary. So I don't write him off either. I'm for Mike Bloomberg, who I think would be the best president of any of them by a mile. Not sure he's going to run. There's talk in the media that he's kind of waiting to see what Biden does, and, we will see. He's not what the computer would spit out to fit the current demography of the Democratic primary, but he has a pretty good monkey trick. He can say, look, I'm a real billionaire, and I'm going to spend $2 billion to throw this canister out of the White House, and I'm the biggest hero on guns and climate change in the entire party, so you kids come later. Let Big Daddy go over here and get rid of the Trump monster, and he'd win a general election. So Bloomberg's got an argument if he decides to run. Of course, he has resources to make sure everybody indeed hears that argument. His struggle will be the second look when there'll be a lot of debate about the NYPD. But we'll see what happens. He's not in, unlike the others. And then finally, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota in a blizzard. She can get a job in cable news doing disaster weather if this doesn't work out. But I'll tell you, it was my favorite announcement. I thought from a technical advance point of view, both the announcements for Elizabeth Warren and for Kamala Harris were perfectly fine. But the grit and the energy and the Midwestern niceness, all the stuff of the Klobuchar thing looked pretty impressive to me. I think, frankly, she is one of their strongest, if not strongest, potential candidates in a general election because I think Trump wouldn't know how to run against her. She would do well in the Midwest. Keep in mind, Wisconsin and Michigan are two of the key battlefields that Trump won, which was Trump's big accomplishment. That, along with Pennsylvania, 3 states we Republicans have not carried in a presidential since the 80s. So I think Amy Klobuchar on paper could be an incredibly tough Democratic candidate in the general election if she can get through the primary. Now, you can tell some of her opponents are worried about her because somebody did that ultimate kiss of welcome into a presidential primary, the Oppo drop a few days before her announcement with a bunch of off-the-record staffers complaining that she was mean to them. Well, having been in this game for 30 years, let me give you a news flash. A lot of candidates are tightly wound people with tempers. That's part of the business. I don't condone it. I've told a few to lighten up, but it does exist, and I think it just might be a cultural thing now. We're complaining off the record to media reporters to try to sabotage your former boss is the new norm. In my day, if it was bad, we told them to fuck off and quit. But, different generation. Anyway, they made a mistake with that Oppo dump. Not that it wasn't newsworthy and not that it probably didn't cause some concern in Klobuchar world, which sounds like a kid's show. Instead, it was bad timing because her announcement blew it all away. It's the kind of thing you save for later when she catches on after winning that big Iowa straw poll in September. So ham-handed work by the opponents are going to need a better fastball than that to kill the monster from Mankato or whatever they're going to dub her. Again, I think in a general election, if I were a Democrat, I'd be looking really hard at her because she has winner, at least at the beginning, all over her. So, we'll see what happens. Her path, she's got to do well early. Iowa, New Hampshire, Iowa's next door to Minnesota. She's got an angle there. She's also got high expectations like Warren and New Hampshire in the same Boston media market, but they've all got pretty strong cards to play. So there are a few more minor candidates running around, a few more likely to jump in. I guess the next one who hasn't run and the last one to talk about would be Joe Biden. He's got that fighter thing in the three piles. He can put that together. He doesn't have identity and he doesn't have progressive economics, but if he can own fighter and he's famous and he's comfortable and he can make an argument about general election appeal, yeah, I can kind of see it. We'll see what happens. We'll be following all this closely at Radio Free GOP. I would say one last footnote about Biden. He has a little bit of the yesteryear problem. He's old. He was a sidekick. Is he really the beacon to tomorrow? That's why some of the younger candidates who can put progressive economics and identity together and fighter, if somebody can do the trifecta, that to me looks like a ticket to the hearts of the Democratic primary voters. But this is all pre-wind tunnel. We will see what happens. Now, the last presidential thing is that muted scream you hear coming from the big coffee pot of politics is one Howard Schultz, the emperor of Starbucks, now the frog in the boiling pot. I feel a little sorry for him. I think he's a good guy. I think he was a terrific CEO, and I suspect he might be a pretty good president, though the political stumbling along lately has kind of shaken that conviction. But I think he's trying to do the right thing. The problem is he's doing it in all the wrong ways. The independent candidacy is always the chimera. Our system is set up for a two-party deal. Now, in the future, when blockchain lets us all vote on our cell phones, the distribution system could break down and this whole third party, fourth party, 11th party, where the left-handed party, that could all happen. I've done races in Latin America where the beer brands run somebody and they come in fourth in the top 10. So that multi-party thing may be in our future. It's not as good as it's cracked up to be. But right now, the third party thing, very hard to get to finish. The other problem, which is unique to now, but even more powerful, is the anti-Trump world is so energized by the president that the idea of another anti-Trump candidate drives them crazy. So Howard gets shouted down before he makes an argument. And the real challenge for Howard Schultz is they are right. He would split the vote. Yes, he would pull some disaffected Republicans from Trump who would never vote for a Democrat. But the key decision people make in a presidential election is thumbs up or thumbs down on the incumbent. Howard Schultz adds a second choice to the thumbs down crowd, splintering it, which does help Trump. A lot of polling proves this. So my feeling is that Howard Schultz, who left a bubble of CEO love and respect, well-earned, by the way, he did a terrific job, but he went from that world to sitting naked on a rock saying, America, I want to be your president, after which there was a pause, and then 50 tons of rotten fruit came flying his way. I doubt that's what he expected, so I doubt his campaign will outlast his book tour. But we will see. We're going to be investigating that and all these things on Radio Free GOP. It is not going to be a dull election year, and the stakes could not be higher. Okay, let's do a little filthy lucre commerce and then come back and interview our friend, Frank Lavin.
He used to have a big career, but now he's had enough. Podcasting's like therapy. His shrink says it's great stuff. Radio Free GOP.
All right, friends and patriots, this is the part of Radio Free GOP where we sell you dinner delivered by UPS. But you know what? We're not doing that today because this episode is brought to you yet again by me. That's right, I'm the sucker. I'm the one paying for this thing. We're kind of semi-regular right now at Radio Free GOP while we figure out our future. And I can say the shark-like humans of the William Morris Endeavor Agency are plotting and scheming. We have a few things afoot. Some are small, which basically means I keep doing this when I get mad enough to do one. Others are a little more regular. And there is one big, terrifically fun and huge possibility, so vast and so powerful that I'm sure the New York Stock Exchange will stop trading, America will freeze, Trump will scurry to the Situation Room to figure out what to do about it. Well, maybe not that big, but we got something interesting that might be coming. I'm just going to tease you now and not tell you because it's not fully baked. And hey, come on, it's a free podcast. What do you want? But I'm hopeful we're going to evolve this thing to the next level. Stay tuned. You will be the first to know. All right, let's go back to the show.
Radio Free GOP.
All right, I've been waiting to do this interview for a long time. Frank Lavin is one of my oldest friends. We met way back in the early 80s when we were fighting the Soviet Union. Frank is from Northern Ohio. He is funny. He has had an incredible career. He's served 3 Republican presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan. He worked in the National Security Council for the last 2 years of the Reagan administration. He was number 2 in the Political Affairs Office. He's worked on campaigns across the country. Later on as a foreign policy expert, particularly on international trade. He worked for the Commerce Department, the State Department. Under secretary level, was our U.S. ambassador to Singapore. Managed to do all that while also being a reserve officer in the U.S. Navy. And because Frank really likes to work hard, he has not only an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where I went to school and where I first met Frank. He also has 3 master's degrees, one in Chinese history and language from Georgetown, one from Johns Hopkins in international relations and economics. And just to throw another thing on the table, he also earned a Wharton MBA, all while working. So he's one of the most impressive guys I know. He and his fantastic wife, Ann, are old and dear friends of mine. We both hold the greatest credential of all, in my view. We're both former chairman of the Georgetown University College Republicans. He's going to talk about the trade war, about security, about what it's like to work in the White House in the old Reagan days when it was a grown-up operation in the Bush days. And finally, about one of my favorite topics, what the hell happened to the Republican foreign policy that I joined this outfit to support? So we're going to talk about all those topics with my friend, the fascinating Frank Lavin.
It's time to ask some questions and go behind the scenes. Here's our latest interview. We'll try to keep it clean. Radio Free GOP.
So welcome to the undisclosed location, former Ambassador Frank Lavin. Thanks for doing the podcast.
Mike, thank you for having me on. Good to be back.
We have known each other going all the way back to the Georgetown College Republicans. So you were emeritus. You had already graduated, and you had run for national CR chairman, and luckily you got beaten down with
the whole thing blew
sleazy
up.
attacks.
The whole thing blew up, but I had a fun. But being in D.C. and coming of age, coming to political maturity in D.C. was, I think, a real blessing. And the formative element, actually, I'd been sort of somewhat involved in politics, but the formative element was I'm at the university during the Jimmy Carter presidency, and this growing sense that the U.S. was not grappling successfully with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was expanding. I think during the Carter presidency, something like 6 countries fell to the Soviets, and that combined with faltering economy really made me energized as a Republican.
Is that the thing? Is that were you thinking Republican thoughts in high school? Or
I was.
college?
I was market oriented, and I was pro defense. Were kind of my views, and it was clear that segment of the Democratic Party was shrinking, and that was sort of the dominant Republican view. So I was, I thought there's no question that Ford would be a better president than Jimmy Carter, and unfortunately didn't prevail in that election.
What the Reagan era was fun because when Reagan came in, there was kind of a Republican almost fad on a lot of campuses. You could actually meet girls at a CR meeting, which I have a feeling is much harder to do now.
Yeah, I think when Carter left office, the economy really was in bad shape. That misery index was at record high, and Reagan came in as an agent of change and a breath of fresh air, and he actually had a policy agenda to build up national defense, to cut taxes, get the economy doing again, and he had a pleasant sort of upbeat demeanor that carried him through all this. So yeah, you could be very proud of Reagan if you were right of center. He was your guy.
So we both went to the Foreign Service School at Georgetown. You graduated. I am still on a leave of absence, by the way. I got to get my paperwork together.
I say write a big check. Write a big check, and you're going to get through that process.
Print a diploma as a receipt. Yeah. But I left my senior year literally on a leave of absence. But tell me about how you got into practical politics and later foreign policy. Let's start. You leave Georgetown. You probably get fired from a few jobs. You decide nothing left but politics. What happened?
I worked in a few statewide races, including while I was in college. I did work for my Senator, Bob Taft, running for re-election in 76 in Ohio. Again, and he lost to Howard Metzema. That was a modest Democratic year, but Carter wins the presidency and the Democrats pick up, and it's sort of an anti-Watergate, clean sweep kind of moment for the Democrats, so they could ride that. And Carter fit that moment. Carter captured that kind of honest, simple, Sunday school teacher.
Peanuts going through the hands. We all remember the image from that ad.
Yeah, and don't forget, he was also a Naval Academy graduate, and could be, reasonably hard line on a few things, at least rhetorically.
He ran that whole nuclear Navy thing, Rickover guy. I mean, I remember that was part of the pitch.
Right. So he could appeal to middle America, and he was a clean guy. There wasn't any scandals and so forth. So he's the right kind of horse to ride against any kind of Nixon legacy. So I worked for Taft in 76, and then in 77, there was a short-lived campaign, just I think in proximity. A great guy. The state treasurer of Virginia is running for lieutenant governor, Walter Craigie, a really good guy, but he lost the nomination to Joe Canada, who then went on to lose to Chuck Robb, LBJ's son-in-law. So I worked in that race. And then
so you buried two of them. You should have gone into political consulting.
We're not young. We're not done. We're not done. In 78, I worked for a very successful Houston attorney who had been involved politically himself, and he was running for Attorney General of Texas in 78, Jim Baker, who was also a great guy. And as we say, thankfully, he lost because that allowed him to become Ronald Reagan's chief of staff after serving as George H.W. Bush's campaign chairman in 79-80. George Bush falters against Reagan in the primary, but Reagan, I think very wisely, chooses him as his running mate, and Baker then comes in somewhat as a surprise to be chief of staff of the Reagan White House.
And then, of course, Baker's first thing is when he gets there, get Frank Lavin in the White House. You wound up on the Reagan staff.
I ended up in the Reagan White House. I started working for the president-elect at either the end of 80, I should say, or I started working for the presidential transition team, and then I came right into the White House on January 20th, 1981, and started in the personnel office, and ended up I worked in the personnel office, public liaison office, the National Security Council, and then the political office under Frank Donatelli for the last 2 years.
How do you think the staff culture now, partially Trump-driven, of course, but also just the way it's evolved is different from when you were there? Because I remember I would go over, in fact, first time I ever went to White House, you invited me to the mess. It was like half off chili day or something. And
boy, you were never invited back. Too,
no. Actually, I showed up for a meeting during the George H.W. Bush re-elect, and they had all the consultants, and right after the war, and the numbers were thin, they went around the room, great, victory. And I said, I think we're going to lose the economy. And literally the door opened by itself, and the chair started moving, and I have not been back.
That happens
since that prediction.
There's a lesson there.
And tell the truth in the White House, not if you can avoid it. Yeah. But in the Trump era, I don't even enter the zip code. But back to it, you could tell it was the White House of the superpower back then. It was a staff culture that way.
Well, there is high professional discipline in the team. If you think of Jim Baker, Ed Meese, Mike Deaver, David Gergen, there was a strong team in the White House. The speechwriter shop, Tony Dolan, so forth. I mean, there were just the caliber of the people involved, I think, were very, very good. That was an important element. The second element is, look, you ask what made that White House successful. Ronald Reagan had a compass. He knew what direction he wanted to take America. So it's sort of management by leadership. It allowed for there to be a very cohesive team because everybody knew that we were going to increase conventional arms spending. We're going to cut tax and get the economy moving again. We're going to go down the path of the Strategic Defense Initiative and beat the Soviets at the tech side of things. And we're going to start sort of a geopolitical offensive, the Reagan doctrine, in providing support to guerrilla groups that were against the Soviets, against what they were doing. So everybody knew this, and that allowed for a lot of staff discipline to go down that path. I think you've got now a president who doesn't necessarily have a compass, and it's a very day-to-day series of interactions. So it's very hard of your staff. I'll tell you something else about Reagan personally. You've got to be sufficiently set in your beliefs that you can provide leadership, but you've also got to, at least at a tactical level, be willing to be coached. And again, this might be the movie and radio heritage to say, look, he had very strong skills, very strong communicator, but if you gave him an idea or suggestion, he would take it under advisement. So there was no arrogance there that a good speech couldn't be made better, or a good event couldn't be made better, and let's do this thing right. So he was a fantastic guy to work with in that sense.
What are your favorite memories of working for Reagan?
I think that one of the challenges if you're president of the United States is it's just intimidating. People are so overwhelmed by the office and the man that when they finally get to see him, they freeze. And these are literally people in, head of a trade association or a foreign leader, and they actually have an agenda or something they want to review with the president. But they're so in awe of the office and the individual that it's hard. What I think was really impressed with Reagan is he knew that. He knew that he had to set the right tone and be gracious and warm and inviting in that first minute to get a conversation going. Because if you just say to the fellow, what's on your mind or how can I help, you don't always get a coherent answer. So he was terrific at that. And we also picked up on that. I picked up on that. Part of my NSC job was working on these Oval Office visits and meetings. We said, let's make sure that the foreign dignitary gets some kind of a pre-brief, which is respectful of the person's position, but helps walk them through to say, listen, you've come all the way from France or Japan or something, and let's walk through the discipline here about what we're going to try to accomplish in this meeting and what we want to see come out of it. So you get a fair chance to make your points, and you get to hear from the president his view, and that's a successful meeting, and it's all done in the spirit of goodwill and hospitality.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a method in any White House, at least historically, where you brief up the president.
Yeah.
There are memos, or not a lot is left to chance. It's all very focused.
Right.
Watching the current White House from the outside, do you think they do any of that, or they just, give them a simple how to pronounce the name and try to make the meeting short?
Yeah, I don't get the sense that Trump has an appetite for sort of the history or the context or what brought this whole meeting about or what our key goals are. He strikes me as a very fly-by-wire kind of guy that he makes decisions on the cuff. He's also, if you don't come at an issue with a strong policy background, then your only way to evaluate the issue is personality. So he's also heavily personality driven. And if it clicks with someone, which is hard to do, then there's a little bit of warmth. Prime Minister Abe of Japan is one area where there was a little bit. By the way, Abe, to his credit, I think read Trump better than a lot of the Westerners. I'll give you one example from their first meeting at Mar-a-Lago. They have a good discussion, and Abe says, I'd like to just share something with you. The last time a U.S. president played golf with a Japanese prime minister was Dwight D. Eisenhower and my grandfather. So what he's really saying in one neat sentence is, I'm basically the long line of succession from Japan, and you're basically Eisenhower. If we play golf again, right. We've now validated this thesis.
I get another meeting.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, that plays right to Trump's sense of self, and he's not saying let me give you trade data on the U.S.-Japan economic relationship. Let me share with you our security treaty and what we do for each other and anti-submarine warfare. Right. I just want to tell you, you look to me like Dwight David Eisenhower.
What I love about that story is all through the campaign, I thought Trump was always banging a big racial gong. It was either Mexicans tunneling in to steal your job and rape everybody and do horrible things, or it was these wily Chinese trade negotiators who were running circles around the nitwits and knuckleheads we send over. Well, cut to a wily Asian rolling him to give him that mind stroke that, hey, you're Eisenhower. Why don't I come back next week with something else? Well, pretty crafty.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, that's kind of what Kim Jong-un has done from North Korea, and a little bit what Xi Jinping has done, too, from China, is they can butter the guy up. They're smart enough to see how he operates, and they're not necessarily engaging with him substantively, but they're just saying, you're one good-looking guy.
Later in your career, I want to go back to the early days in the White House, but that brings an idea to my mind. You were one of those idiot trade negotiators.
Yes.
You were, I don't remember the exact fancy title, but you were Undersecretary for Trade in the Commerce Department in the Bush administration.
Right.
Were you guys all a bunch of idiots? Were you constantly rolled by Fu Manchu-like foreigners who dazzled you with their inscrutable ways?
Yeah.
I have a feeling, having played poker with you, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
I want my watch back.
Look, there was a sort of bipartisan view of trade policy that lasted really from 1948, when the U.S. helped set up the GATT, all the way till about the Trump administration. We saw some hints of this under Obama, but Obama sort of moved toward consensus view. And the view was this, that if you lower barriers to trade, the economy prospers. Open societies move ahead and closed societies stagnate. And all you have to do is look at places like Japan, have a lot of protectionism, or like France that has a lot of protections, and say, boy, those economies have not grown in 20 or 30 years. It's 1% growth. So luckily, we've got a reasonably open economy, reasonably low tariffs. So this was a bipartisan view. Now, Trump disagrees with that. Trump says the idea is not low tariffs, not more trade, but the goal is trade balance, that what you buy must equal what you sell, which nobody from an economic background or trade background adhered to that kind of view. So from his mindset, Other people were deficient, and he's strong. Now, the odd thing is that he's pursuing policies that won't take you to that finish line. He's pursuing policies that haven't improved the trade deficit or trade balance, and he's gotten in trade quarrels with countries like Canada, South Korea, Mexico, that are generally viewed as very law-abiding, very rules-based in their trade regime, and a very positive relationship with the United States.
Yeah, so it's not a master strategy, so to speak. It's more impulsive.
I think it impulse, and remember, Trump, first and foremost, is a grievance politician. Yeah. There's a sense of what's wrong in America. And if you combine this quest for what's wrong with a kind of exculpatory worldview, meaning every problem in America is because someone has done something to us, there's always an audience for that kind of language. I think it's ultimately pretty harmful. But if you say the reason steel workers in America have declined quite considerably over the last 20 years, well, it's because of Canadian steel producers or Korean steel producers. I think that's really takes you in the wrong way. It's not really very accurate. I mean, what you have is cars in America use about half the steel now they used 20 or 30 ago. So there's a lot of drivers here, and we don't import a lot. Toyota USA takes about 90% of its steel from U.S. steel producers, only about 10% is imported. Yeah. So it's not a huge driver of activity.
No, cars are lighter now as part of the fuel economy green agenda, so we don't need as much steel.
You don't need as much steel. And here's an interesting thing to give you an example of exculpatory politics. Every oil company in America over the last 50 years changed from being an oil company to being an energy company. They all migrated into alternative sources and natural gas and renewables and so forth, wisely seeing the market shifting, technology shifting, and so forth. But my point is, not one steel company in America moved into polymers, moved into specialty plastics, moved into anything to say, look, we're really in sort of the structural business here, and demand for steel might be shrinking. And if we don't move into these allied spaces, we're going to give up market share. And that's indeed what's happened over the last 20 years.
It's a sophisticated world, and open markets liberalize countries and raise everybody's standard of living. Let me jump back to some career stuff, and then I do want to talk about the trade war with you and a whole bunch of other topics. But we have an interesting listenership here at Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance. Most monarchs, international leaders, Fortune 100 CEOs are glued to this podcast. But we also have a lot of pro wrestling fans, knuckleheads like me. So I want to ask a couple of questions about just working in the White House. What is it like, we're going back in your career now, to be kind of a lower level grunt on the NSC? How does the National Security Council work? Do you really go out and order assassinations all the time and tap people's Facebook accounts now and all that stuff? Because, I'm joking, of course, but there's this fictional kind of view of a lot of black Suburbans pulling up in the middle of the night and everything. Why don't you walk through how the NSC works and what it was like to be a junior staffer there and what you would do every day?
Sure. Look, some of this sort of myth of the NSC came because of sort of the Ollie North type of activities in Iran-Contra, and Ollie was an opera. I mean, Ollie was a field guy. As you say, there's sort of two truths in life. Did
you know Fawn Hall, by the way?
I knew Fawn. I knew Ollie. We did work.
What was Fawn like?
Fawn was very pleasant, very capable person. Her mother also worked at the NSC. Wilma also worked there. And Fawn went on to marry the manager or the road manager for the Doors. If you're a Hollywood guy, small world. So Fawn was very professional, very good. I mean, you've got to be careful about empowering people, and people can misuse that White House title. So Ollie got in an area where he never should have used. The NSC should not be operational is the short answer to that question.
Yeah, because it's designed to coordinate you should explain that.
I would say there's really two things it does do. One is to interagency coordination, and so you have a series of directorates in the NSC: African desk, Mideast desk, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union desk, and so forth. Then you have functional ones: strategic arms control and public diplomacy. So you've got a dozen or so of these directorates, and their job is to plug in with their State Department counterparts, Defense Department, intelligence community. Sometimes it's Treasury or Commerce or other people, but you've got to synthesize their views. And this allows for an interagency committee structure. At the very tippy top is what's called a Cabinet Council or the National Security Council, where the formal members of the Security Council meet and make a decision or recommendation to the president. But that takes place only after sub-councils and working groups have vetted this matter, because if you're a good manager, you've solved a problem at the lowest level possible. So the NSC manages this whole hierarchy of interagency decision-making and structures. So there'd be an interagency meeting on Central America would involve a half dozen agencies to make some decisions.
Because Commerce would have their point of view about economic soft power. The CIA would have a point of view. Military intelligence would have a point of view. State would have a point of view. You got to kind of put it on a blender to give the president a clear view to make a decision.
Sure. All of these, look, there's trade-offs in all these decisions. What do we emphasize or what do we want to do? I mean, when I was at the Commerce Department, we worked on reestablishing Iraq's commercial code after the war, after Saddam Hussein is gone. You've got a new government. Well, should they have tariffs? What kind of economy should it be? Was there an Iraqi stock market? What do you do about it? So you're providing technical expertise to help the Iraqi economy perform, but you're just one piece of a broader puzzle. There's two things the NSC does primarily. One is this interagency coordination. The second is you're supporting the person of the president. You're supporting the president for his foreign trips, for receiving foreign visitors, for diplomatic presentations, for congratulatory messages when Prime Minister of Spain's reelected. And so anything.
Right, they do the classic phone call, the 3x5 card.
The phone calls, the First Lady's trips, or if the First Lady of Australia is visiting the U.S. and wants to pay a call, so you're coordinating with the family about the president's personal role. So, for example, for Reagan, our goal was to have one state dinner a month and use those state dinners as a vehicle for trying to move a relationship in a certain way, and that also allows them to augment the meeting with the president with 3 or 4 days of meetings in Washington and a side trip to New York or someplace, and you're really trying to move that relationship one notch ahead and using the hospitality of the White House and the stature of the presidency to get where you want to go.
So what was a typical day like on the NSC back there? You'd probably roll in around 10:30, check out Fawn, make some free long distance calls. I mean, actually, what would a typical day be?
These are you had your staff meetings at 8 a.m. and you better be brief.
And you work Saturdays too.
You work Saturdays. By the way, you've got to be brief to go into the staff meetings. I mean, you can't show up at 7:59 and go in. You're going to spend an hour going through cable traffic and saying who's doing what, who's
and explain cable traffic too.
Well, the U.S. system produces a lot of diplomatic cables, classified material, just churns out a lot of material that comes through. So there's our embassies overseas. There's CIA analysts. There's economic reports from Commerce or Trade. So there's a lot of material that just gets churned through. But you're supposed to be on top of your brief and be able then to have a discussion with other officers in the NSC about what's going on and what are we trying to do. So you've got to be informed at the start. So every day we begin with an 8 a.m. staff meeting, right, which means you're in at your desk usually around 7 and you're barreling away. They were reasonably long days. And the White House has its own inter-office coordination that's run through a device called the Secretariat, where, for example, the president's going to Berlin and he's going to give a speech. Well, the draft speech goes all around, and the congressional affairs guys have to be happy, and the NSC people have to be happy. Everybody's got to sign off. So, and again, if there's 3 weird paragraphs in that speech that somebody's not happy about, then you have a subgroup meeting and people are hammering this thing out. So it's a labor-intensive activity, but you end up with a very good final product.
Right, because that's how you run a superpower. President's words have real impact.
Yeah, and you got to be willing to take everybody's input. You want advice or thoughts or comments from everybody, but then somebody at the end of the day has to harmonize. So Peter Robinson is the speechwriter who puts into the Berlin speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The State Department guys said, look, that's too provocative. We don't like that. We're not comfortable with it. They go to the president directly and say, take it out. But the president says, that's a great line. That is a great line. We do want to take down the wall. And it also just is a very pithy illumination of the difference between a free society and a repressive society, right? So he puts it back in. So good for him.
Right, exactly. That's why it was Reagan. So I've got to ask the gossipy question. When you were a staffer there at the NSC, what ally was both cherished and beloved, but also, oh, Christ, them again? Who are the higher maintenance?
Let me say this. Most people fit into the system reasonably well. I would say that his best buddy, the president's best buddy, who would have very frank first-person discussions with him, was Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really almost shocking to me the first time you see these transcripts. And I was with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Camp David, and she would literally, the only person I saw refer to him as Ronnie. And say, now, Ronnie, this is what we're looking at. And the first time you hear it is kind of shocking because you almost think it's disrespectful. But he had a very warm relationship with a lot of respect. And that didn't faze him at all, that it was that kind of a relationship.
How did the Foreign Office staff her? Long leash, or were they right on her too?
They would accompany her, but she, I think, had maybe more confidence or as much confidence in the U.S. system, what we were saying, as her own team, right? So she valued getting briefings from U.S. agencies on what's going on and so forth. there were two countries we worked with, both very friendly, both very professional, both very supportive, but they had an anxiety about the relationship. They had that sort of dependency relationship that did provoke a little bit of anxiety, and that was Japan and Israel. And what we saw from Japan in particular is every presidential meeting with every Japanese prime minister had to, quote unquote, be better than the last one. So if one prime minister got a 40-minute meeting or 1 hour meeting with the president, the next guy had to come in and get 75 minutes.
And they really count stuff like that.
Well, the Japanese press picks this up.
Yeah.
So these are tea leaves that, the president saw your predecessor for an hour, but you got less, is a huge disgrace in what's going on. And I remember one of the prime minister's visits, and I don't want to share the name, but I remember one of the visits took place after a visit of the King of Jordan. Now, that's important because the King of Jordan gave a gift. Reagan's a big horseman. He grew up with horses. He was in the Iowa National Guard Cavalry, and he's out on his ranch horses. So the King of Jordan gives the president a stallion as a gift. And of course, the president can't keep it, but that's a great gift. So the Japanese,
where does it go? What happens?
National Park,
National
Park Service took it, and he rides on weekends. I mean, he enjoys riding. And I think after he left office, he had his own horse, so he didn't take that. But what was interesting is the Japanese come in a month later, and they say, "I got a great idea. We can give him a horse."
Yeah.
They said,
better horse.
Exactly. We said, we just did that. We can't get a horse of a week. I mean, don't you think it's a little thin idea for, the guy said, but it works. It worked it's not going to work twice in a row. I can tell you. They said, well, what can we do? I said, well, you can go to a baseball. Well, they'd gone to a baseball game several years earlier. There's only a few cultural, Reagan's not going to eat sushi with these guys. He's not going to do the kimono tea service. I mean, there's not a lot of points of overlap, right? Besides horses and baseball, you've done it.
Yeah, Godzilla movies.
Exactly.
There's just not a lot to work with.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Now, can you imagine what the Trump guys are dealing with? Because he's putting the diamond pinky ring in his pocket and not telling anybody. And,
well, I think he has limited appetite. I think, for example, look, there wasn't necessarily a lot of personal chemistry with Helmut Kohl as German chancellor. He's not necessarily a warm, jocular guy, but there was enormous respect for him and enormous respect for the relationship. So when Helmut Kohl came in, the president's all ears. The president's saying, how do you see things? We're looking through a series of very sensitive military deployments. What's your take on this? And do you think we're going to be able to get through this? So he's, just from a business point of view, so to speak, he's very interested in what Kohl has to say. But I don't think Trump brings that to the table. I think if Angela Merkel...
Trump will lecture somebody like that about, you guys are not paying the price. They will answer that we're walking distance away from Russian armored divisions here, and you're, giving us the... I don't think Trump has the sensibility to ever think about anybody else's point of view.
I think so. I think you're right. By the way, I also see sort of a defensive move for Trump in this, meaning if you're not going to read your briefs, you're not going to understand Angela Merkel, you're not going to think about NATO deployment in Germany, why don't you just go in and say, Angela, you're not doing a good job? So it's a way of getting out of the final exam, so to speak, by just saying you're cheating and you're not good and you need to do a better job, and I'll see you next week, okay? Keep in touch. Yeah. So it just sidesteps any questions or points she has to make.
Yeah, I hear the Trump briefings are like a cartoon show. It's not the normal model. So anyway, at the last 2 years of the Reagan administration, you ran the political office. Right. So what is that job like from dawn to dusk? What do you do as White House political director?
Yeah. By the way, Frank Donatelli was assistant to the president, so he's over me, great guy, but I'm the office director. And what we're looking at, frankly, is how do we legally use Reagan and use any other government resources, surrogates, cabinet members, and so forth, to support then Vice President Bush running to succeed Reagan. What can we do to help this guy? And there's the whole Republican ticket. There's Senate candidates, and so forth. And look, you have to, for example, have the campaign committee pay for presidential trip. You can't use federal government funds. But for example, Conrad Burns is running for Senate, and the green issues, the environmental issues there, and Reagan, I can't remember the specific bit of legislation, but it was some kind of natural resources bill that supported the national park system or forest system. And he was able to thank Conrad Burns in the course of his signing remarks, and that helps remind people that Burns is serious about the environment. So you're able just to frame issues in a way that can help certain candidates.
Yeah, you try to give them wins too. You might have some deal about Mount Rushmore needs a new coat of paint. Well, you time it right so Larry Pressler can go take a bow or wherever it might be. So another great job you had later in your career was the U.S. ambassador to Singapore. Yeah. What does an ambassador do? I'm asking these kind of basic questions, and then I'll try to wind around to policy stuff.
Sure. Well, look, broadly speaking, you're responsible for the U.S. relationship with your counterpart countries, right? What is the U.S. national interest? What are we trying to reassure in this relationship? How do we forge a consensus between the two countries? And how do we just advance things in general? So you've got an array of issues from security cooperation, geopolitical issues, force deployment, ship visits, and so forth, military-related activities. But with Singapore, you've actually got a set of economic activities as well. Enormous American investment there. More investment for quite some time in Singapore than in China. I mean, just a huge, because it's English-speaking, it's rules-based, a former British colony, so they took the British commercial code. So Americans feel very comfortable there doing business, and it's a clean, meaning clean both in the sense of green and also in the sense of no corruption. So it's a great place to...
And the sidewalks, you're never going to see chewing gum.
It's a button-down place. Yeah, you bet.
Did you ever have to deal with that as an ambassador, like some idiot spit, and the chairman of Bell and Howell's son's going to get 3 whippings, and the phone's ringing off the hook?
Yeah, it is a button-down place, but the good news is most Americans sort of get that, and we're not close enough. If we were in the Caribbean, close enough to get the college student who's drinking too much, we might have had some of those, but there just wasn't the casual tourist or the goofy college student who was looking for trouble. Look, you would have, say, 25,000 Americans in Singapore, and about once a month there would be an arrest, a formal arrest. There might be other times where there's a warning or inquiry or whatever, but we tell people, listen, if there's no charges filed, you are a lucky man. I'll tell you, I'll walk through one story for you.
Yeah.
We flowed through Singapore when the United States went into Afghanistan post 9/11. We flowed through Singapore 2 carrier battle groups. So huge amount of population carrier battle group. And this is because it's the way from Japan or Guam or Pearl Harbor is through the Malaccan Strait, through Singapore.
And they've got one of the few ports that can take an American aircraft
You can
carrier.
tie up an aircraft carrier in Singapore. You're right. Good trivia, Mike. But
Putin told me.
Yeah, because there is such a large U.S. population flowing through, there can be 10,000 plus sailors in a carrier battle group. So all these people are dumped into Singapore for a night, and they've been at sea. So you're always concerned about behavioral issues. Okay, we have a shore patrol that helps out. And one thing these folks do, I think quite wisely, is they have little business cards with a local phone number on it, and they run around to every single bar on the Strip in Singapore and say, listen, if you see anything that makes you unhappy or uncomfortable, you call us, and we'll take the guy back to the ship. And he doesn't,
you don't need to bother the local police.
Well, because they can only call the police if the crimes happen. But we're saying if you just think this guy's too loud or just rude or whatever, and he's clearly going the wrong way, we'll just escort him back to the ship, right? We can do. Everybody says that's good, that's very helpful. But here's what happened: the shore patrol gets a call. They say, you got a guy here. There's a bunch of sailors. There's one guy who's clearly louder and louder and clearly boisterous and clearly going the wrong way, and he's not taking suggestions. Why don't you get him back to the ship? And sure enough, the guys show up, and nothing's happened. There's been no incident, no crime, but clearly it's time for this guy to call it night. So they get him back to the ship, and he passes out in the car back to the ship, and they literally put him in a brig. These ships have brigs. They put him in the brig. We'll straighten this out in the morning. They go see him in the morning. He's not a sailor. They just picked up a guy with short hair, an American who was short hair, who's like drinking with the sailors, and he is causing a ruckus, and and he obviously was a
is
bit
he in
steamed.
the Navy now?
This is the grand tradition of the 19th century. This is where the word Shanghai came from, right? So
exactly.
It's the grand tradition of the fleet is to get but he was, as you can imagine, he was a bit unhappy about his situation, and I'm going to sue everybody and so forth. But our point to him was, look, I understand why you're unhappy, but these guys did do you a favor. If you'd been drinking another 20 minutes and if you had punched somebody or broken a window, God knows what, you would be. So they did you a favor. You can be unhappy about it. They did you a favor. Second of all, I don't think you want to sue because it's in the whole thing's in the public record. I mean, you might win legally, but we're having this huge debate about how drunk you were and what happened.
Right.
So why don't we just, call it a win?
Here's a free Navy hat.
Exactly. Yeah, he did. By the way, he took that advice. Yeah, so he's a regional sales dude, and
today he's a U.S. congressman.
Exactly.
I was going to ask if it were you. You were a naval officer in the reserves, so I thought it might have been your story.
No, it was not. It was not me. I was a desk guy. Just looking at Chinese.
So give me a typical day as the U.S. ambassador to Singapore. You have to get past your Gurkha guy. I remember I went over to visit you.
Yeah.
One morning, I was jet lagged, so at 3 a.m, I went out on like the backyard to wander around because I wasn't sleeping well. And this guy jumps out of the bushes.
I
met my first Gurkha at the other end of the weapon.
Yeah.
And then later I asked him to show me the knife, but you stopped me. This is an interesting story.
Well, a knife for the Gurkhas is somewhat a holy or say sacred instrument, and there is a god who must be appeased if the knife is drawn, and you can only appease the god by drawing blood. So presumably you do this only in combat and you're drawing your enemy's blood. But the point is, if somebody says, "Show me your
Mike
knife,"
Murphy says, "Jeepers, is that a Gurkha knife? Can I see it?"
So if he takes his knife out, he's got kukri. It's a very deadly weapon.
Pretty scary knife.
Pretty scary knife. He's got to then slash himself. He's got to cut his palm to draw blood, because you cannot reholster that knife once drawn unless you've drawn blood.
Wow.
That's the military tradition of the Gurkhas. So yeah, you're wise not to push that point. It's
you saved me from an embarrassing incident.
Well, I think you're under permanent surveillance of the police in Singapore. They've got your photo at the.
So after you have your idiot American friend almost make a poor Gurkha guy cut his hand off because he wants to see the knife, and you go off. What's a day in the life of a U.S. ambassador?
Sure.
In
So
Singapore?
you've got a range of these kind of initiatives. You've got a reasonable military presence, reasonable connectivity. For example, Singapore itself, small geographically, just doesn't have airspace, so they do a lot of training at Luke and Cannon Air Force Base in the U.S. Singapore has more personnel stationed in the U.S. than any military in the world.
I mean, Singapore military. Singapore
military, they're training. They fly 15s and 16s, right? And they don't have the airspace to do a lot of things, train air-to-air combat and train things. There's no place to do that. So we do a lot of coordination work with the Singapore
They strike
military.
me as being very quietly armed to the teeth, by the way.
Well, think of this. It is geographically a small country, say 25 miles by 35 miles. So there's no defense in depth. They don't have the luxury of, on the second day we'll regroup. Right. So you've got to be armed to the teeth, and you've got to be able to really throw a punch. When I left, I remember these figures when I left off, it was now a few years ago, but Japan had the most formidable alliance military for the U.S. in Asia, had 150 F-16s. Singapore had 60. So Singapore's got 40% the air power of Japan. So it can throw a punch.
Gotcha.
Right. But that's how you keep the peace, is having that ability. So anyhow, we'd have a lot of defense coordination and exchanges and ship visits and exercises at sea, and we'd have officers cross-assigned and so forth. That was on the defense and security side. We would do on the commercial economic side enormous amount of trade missions and investments and pitching and helping U.S. companies in the market. And it's a great market for American goods because it's affluent. So they have, basically similar tastes, but with a reasonably small population, now about 6 million, there's not a huge indigenous manufacturing. So these great American brands from, Brooks Brothers to Nike to Starbucks just do very, very well in that market. Right. And, we had an agricultural attaché because they also have to import their grains and so forth. We had then a lot of regional billets there because Singapore is a great place for to cover the region, good air connectivity, good schools, and medical support. So you would have things like the FAA ran the regional programs out of Singapore. And look, what do? Well, they've got a lot of things to do with, especially post 9/11, to make sure that the air safety and screening activity at these partner airports where flight to U.S. originates is up to speed. And it's an audit type function, right? And also training and cross assignments and so forth. But the same thing happens, for example, NCIS had a regional office there because you have a military presence, and these guys handled everything from New Zealand to
it's kind of the most, I think, for corporate America, friendliest place to put your people in Asia, where the assimilation is pretty easy. It's got a business infrastructure.
Sure. And look, you can, just as if you were moving to a new town in the U.S., it might take you a little bit of time, but you can participate. I mean, if you get assigned to Omaha, you can, find the church you want in Omaha, the sports team you want. If you like cross-country racing or something, you can find this stuff in any city. Well, you can find it all in Singapore, too, and it's all accessible. It's English-speaking, and they're very happy to have you come in and join the volleyball team or whatever.
So you've lived in Asia since?
Well, off and on for about 20 years. But remember, after the Singapore assignment, I came back and I was George W. Bush's Commerce Undersecretary.
Right,
so I was back
for Asia, right?
Well, it was global. That's
international
global. That
trade.
was global. But there was one issue there, and it's China. So that was probably absorbed 50% of our time was China, 50% of the time everything else.
Well, let's roll into that. We now have an alleged trade war going on. What's your view as a professional in that area?
Yeah, look, I think Trump's done a few things right and a few things wrong, if I may use those kind of direct terms. Look, I think he's right to put the spotlight on China. I think they are really an outlier in a lot of trade practices, high tariffs, protectionist policies, compulsory IP licensing, and they're ignoring some WTO rulings. So I think they should have that kind of attention on them. Now, where I think he tactically got this wrong is saying, let me also put global steel tariffs around the world on Canada, Mexico, Europe, and so forth. You said that takes the spotlight off of China, and you're starting a fight with everybody in the world. right? Where there's, Canada is not cheating on steel. And he uses this national security rule to do it. So everybody knows it's a little bit dodgy. So that's where he got that wrong. And I'll tell you something else that I think he fairly deserves criticism for, Mike, is we had on the table a trade reduction in Asia, tariff reduction in Asia called the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah, I think the loss of that, because it was such an important geopolitical agreement beyond the economics. And to be fair, the Hillary Clinton folded on that like a cheap chair too, because the Democratic left didn't.
Well, you talk about a curveball. Bernie Sanders says, I'm against it. Hillary Clinton, who helped write it, says, well, I'm against it too. Trump is not going to be done by anybody being more nationalist or protectionist. So he says,
nobody's going to out China hate me.
Nobody's going to out Trump. But here's the point. If you're trying to attach a cost to China for bad behavior, well, there's two ways to do it. You can raise tariffs on China, which he's done, or you can lower tariffs with everybody else. Now, if you do it the first way, you're hurting the U.S. economy. You're raising the price of inputs, and you're going to increase prospect of inflation. And so you pay an economic cost for just raising tariffs. If you do it the second way, to say, well, China, if you're not really playing fair, we're going to play more with the other guys, you're helping the U.S. economy. So I think it's unfortunate that Trump sort of threw that in the trash can, and all he's doing is a tit-for-tat tariff back and forth. By the way, I think China does move. I think, I think the president's strength of what he's doing is that his complaints are, by and large, valid complaints. And I think China does move to deal with some of them, but I couldn't give you a number. We haven't seen the end yet. Are they going to fix 10% of what's broken or 30% or what? But it'll be something, I think, in that range. And they know a few things about Trump where I think they've got him sort of sussed out. One is that Trump has got to be the hero of every story he tells.
Yeah.
So Trump cannot say, I really took a flyer with China. I didn't get much out of it, or only got what other presidents got out. Trump has to say, I solved this thing. I built the wall. I fixed NAFTA. I fixed South Korea, and I solved China. So he's got to declare victory. Well, if you know the guy you're negotiating with has to declare victory, then give him as little as possible, right? Then you're disincentivizing him. So that's unfortunately, Trump's kind of painted himself in the corner. The other point to remember about Trump is he fatigues. He gets bored, that his number one issue he runs on is repeal Obamacare, and he doesn't put a day's work into that project. Right. But that's just the other thing he wants to do is to tackle immigration change. He hasn't fixed immigration. We're now into build the wall, but I mean, he hasn't. So his main issues that animated his entire campaign, he just gets bored after a year or two. He makes sort of a half-hearted try, and he said, So I have a feeling that's kind of where China is, that he's going to just say, look, I punched them in the nose. I'm good at that. I got something out of it, and will sort of partially declare victory, but it's going to fade a lot. I think, by the way, my prediction is he keeps the 10% tariffs in place that he put in place, but he doesn't take them up to 25 as he was threatening.
Right. What is the view in Asia of Trump, both the PRC and our other allies like Japan, Australia, Singapore?
Look,
what do they think? Like temporary toddler in charge, it'll revert to norm, or this is going to be a problem for a while? I mean, what is there?
But I'll tell you something. There's one or two things he's done that they're taking him a lot more serious than Obama. Right, that Obama was a charming guy, a pleasant guy, engaged there, but you say, what did Obama stand for or do? And it's not entirely clear.
I was worried when he went to get the Olympics and he was rolled by the Brazilian Minister of Sport early in his term. That's where I started thinking, impressive unifying figure, but foreign policy chops ain't no Nixon.
Yeah, and I think you'd say, look, Obama's real goal in life, which he was sadly denied, was to be Prime Minister of Canada. He said, look, I've got the stage presence, I've got the speech, I've got the smile, I've got a wonderful family, and I don't have to do anything. Right. Nobody's afraid of me. I just meet with people. I go to these UN fora, and I'm the Davos guy, and I'm not responsible for any outcomes. Just say, well, as President of the United States, you're actually responsible for the outcome.
Trudeau is doing a pretty good Obama now under that definition.
Trudeau's doing fine. He's a very friendly guy, and he's got a kind demeanor and so forth. But to your point, I think China just didn't take him seriously. And when Putin went into Crimea and funded these groups, after that is when China said the South China Sea is ours. We can do it. This guy's not going to push back. And it's, the candy store is open, let's grab. And that's also when Kim Jong-un said, oh, well, I can start nuclear testing again, and I can start missile overflights. I can throw missile overflights over Japan, elsewhere. But here's this is why I'm saying
this is all the Obama red line never being crossed, and the ability of people.
But to bring it back to Trump, remember Xi Jinping is having dinner with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and in the middle of the meal, Trump orders missile strikes in Syria because they're being malfeasant something. But Xi takes that on board. Obama never would do that. And Trump says,
but
watch
do you think
me.
she would think this is a little bit of a vaudeville act? But still, I get the fact that
Nonetheless,
Yeah.
you're saying, I had an 8-year free ride here with a guy who had a great smile, and now I had a guy who's lobbing missiles. And the other thing Trump did that was quite seriously that registered to everybody is he did tighten the sanctions on North Korea. Now, he's not been,
which were working. I mean, it got him to the table, and now he's decided it's a bromance, not a negotiation.
Yeah. Look, there's all sorts of things that Trump might be doing wrong with North Korea. He vastly overstated the outcome of the Singapore meeting. I was saying they've agreed to, where anybody reading the data said no place in any statement did they agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons. But boy, there's two things that they stopped doing, which were their testing nuclear weapons and the overflight.
Yeah.
So if they either directly got that from Trump, watch out, friend, because you are going to get shellacked. Trump used some very tough rhetoric with North Korea about if you guys try anything, we are going to paste you, okay? So either that in itself directly made the difference, or the Chinese picked this up and said to North Korea, listen, you guys can get away with a lot. Don't push this guy.
Yeah.
He might actually shellac you.
Yeah. So they see a little bit of embedded, unpredictable danger in
Yeah, and he's got a little backbone. I think Obama would say, look, I will always do the right thing in foreign policy as long as it is cost-free.
Yeah.
I don't want any friction or ill will, right?
Yeah.
I'm here to be your best friend.
Right.
And Trump said, you know what? If you're trying to move somebody like Kim Jong-un, you better inject some friction and you better be willing to be the bad cop. So you'd say, interestingly, Trump enjoys being the bad cop with everybody, but this is one time you probably needed a bad cop.
Right. It strikes me he is good at the bad cop, but he doesn't have the skills to land the thing when they're willing to give something.
He doesn't have a good final act. He doesn't know how to close it. He doesn't close it. And he'll be indiscriminate with the bad cop. He'll go up to Ottawa and say, you guys are the greatest trouble in the world. We have to come after you. And he'll say the same thing in Mexico. Think of this. Maybe American public does want to be a little more hardline on immigration, a little tougher. All right, that's where public sentiment is. That's where Trump is. I can understand that. But if you're going to go down that path, you would do so with grace.
Yeah.
You would say the Mexicans are actually really good friends. We do a lot of collaborative stuff with them, and that country's moved the right way toward democracy and open markets, so we're very proud of our relationship. We do have our rights as well to have a secure border, so we're going to tighten some things up. I mean, So you do it with a kiss, not with a punch.
Yeah. I was down in Mexico City some weeks back, and a Mexican politician made me laugh, senior guy, kind of behind the scenes type, and he said, boy, if we hear this damn thing about paying for the wall one more time, I'm going to tell the president to say, no, we're not going to pay for the wall, but if you don't shut up, we're going to start paying for the ladders. Which,
That's a good line.
Yeah, pretty clever line. Is there a view that Trump is temporary, or this is the new Republican foreign policy beyond Trump? Because we're in a different world than the GOP foreign policy that you and I grew up.
Yeah.
The Atlantic Alliance, dedication to free trade, a more rational grand strategy sort of thing. And I wonder what they think about that.
But by the way, you could really say a lot of that started, nascent hints of this change under Obama. I mean, Obama would point to Iraq and Afghanistan and George W. Bush and say, look, this was just a mistake. It cost a lot of goodwill. So we should be
a little more passive.
We're going to pull back. And Trump just rode that pony harder, and he's got a lot less finesse than Obama, but it's somewhat the same thing. I think this is somewhat a natural shift, given we're in an era of protracted peace. I mean, there's you could say the small wars, and certainly Afghanistan, Iraq, but the point is, there's not a Cold War threat. There's not a geopolitical crisis. We have mischievous countries like Russia, and we have outlier rogue states like Iran and North Korea, but there's no geopolitical threat. There's no predatory nation that's going to make life miserable for the U.S. So in that moment, it's harder and harder to say, well, we need this global architecture and global participation. I mean, in my view, we do. In my view, there's going to be a price to be paid for dialing all of this down. But you can sort of understand the appeal from Obama's point of view or Trump's point of view to say, look, this is the cost-benefit equation here is out of whack. All of this thing we're doing internationally just cost a lot. It doesn't really get us anything. So let's dial it back. I think the Chinese see that, and they're filling that vacuum. But I think they also see that in terms of economic management, China kind of mismanaged this. China had the opportunity to rise over the last 20 years to the global community standards, and they just didn't. And it does create
And by global community standards, you mean in their behavior?
Well, asymmetrical tariffs and banning whole sectors and sort of gaming the system a bit.
Right, sure.
And the trouble is, if you're Peru and you do this, kind of nobody cares, right? Your brother-in-law is the Coca-Cola guy for Peru, and you're not going to allow any competition. You say that. But China is so big.
Yeah.
That their economic rise consistently outpaced their liberalization. So after a decade or two of that, you say, boy, this is really out of whack. In a way, you're sort of glad that Trump is putting that spotlight on there because they needed to hear that.
No, the problem is real. I just think his sophistication and we only get a good outcome from it.
Yeah, I agree. He's not a detailed guy. and he doesn't see the value. There's real value in the trade relationship with China, right? So be careful about what you're throwing out or what you're barking at because we want to keep the good stuff.
Yeah. No. It can go very sideways.
Right.
The Graham Allison book is pretty good about historical analogies of incumbent powers dealing with quickly rising powers. They can go very bad.
Well,
too.
I'll give you one example, and this will take, I think, 5 years to play out. The U.S. owned the Chinese soybean market, the largest consumer purchaser of soybeans in the world. And Trump says, well, too bad we're not selling you anymore. I mean, there's a tariff for us, so they're not buying anymore. So probably a more accurate way of putting it. Well, look, this will take a few years because of irrigation and forest clearing. Brazil's going to get the benefit of this.
Yeah, they're going to get great at soybeans.
And China's going to put in the money. China's going to say $1 billion for irrigating this forest and clearing it and get the soybeans. That's not a problem.
Here you go. They're doing it all over Africa now.
We cannot have our entire food chain be relying on
a reality
US.
show guy getting elected president.
Exactly. It's going to happen again. And they say, where's our soybean? So you're throwing away a lot. You're risking a lot by going down this tariff path.
It reminds me, I get to belong to 2 unions, and I work as a writer in Hollywood. And every time the Writers Guild goes on strike, we teach the networks how to make shows without writers. And we come back and we get an inch on the strike settlement, and a third of the writers aren't working anymore.
Right.
So one quick China question before we're going to go on to politics and then wrap up. What do you read to keep up on smart stuff in China in English?
Oh, I'll tell you this. The 2 best U.S. outlets for China are New York Times and Wall Street Journal. They have really good reporting teams, a lot of really good coverage there. The Economist, I think, is good for analysis. Are there
special editions you get online, like the Hong Kong Wall Street Journal?
There's Asia Wall Street Journal. There's Asia Wall Street Journal. And look, there's a whole universe of think tanks and academics and authors and bureau chiefs. Bloomberg does a pretty good job, but it tends to be narrowly in the sort of operational business space.
Yeah.
So we spent a fair amount of time. My current business is all China focused, so I spent a fair amount of time following that. But I'll tell you, you won't get day-to-day China news any more than the old Soviet Union. You get day-to-day Soviet news. You can look, there's more data available, especially economic data. So, for example, people will look at electricity consumption in China and freight car usage in China to try to model GDP and say, here's what the Statistical Bureau is saying, but here's what, if I look at electrical demand, electrical supply, here's what I'm saying.
Because the Chinese have never been above putting a little English on the statistics.
Well, interestingly, each province has to submit a GDP number, right? As you'd expect, the provincial party leadership has to say, here's what happened in our province. And then they have a national number, not too different than state numbers in the U.S. But it was interesting that every single provincial number came in above average. Every single one.
Because nobody wants to be at the bottom of the
Nobody
totem
can say,
pole.
I'm the governor of Hubei, and I'm not that good. Everybody has to say, no, I am above average.
They have their politics,
right.
too.
So 50% above, or 100% above average, right?
It's like polls, are you a good driver? 97% of people say, I'm an excellent driver.
Yeah, well, I don't blame them. I would not write a piece of paper that says I'm in the bottom half here.
It's well known that we're a must-listen over in the PRC. We have billions of... anything in the year of the pig you want to say in the native tongue over to our Chinese friends?
Well, I think it's important to remember.
That was a hint to speak Chinese. I'm trying to have the only Chinese speaker to ever be on Radio Free GOP.
Well, what we say is Gong Xi Fa Zai, which is prosperity and acquire wealth. And, Xin Nian Kuai Le is Happy New Year. So that's very, very common. Number one holiday in the world in terms of travel, 400 million people traveling Chinese New Year.
There's a great documentary about that, which, of course, I forgot the name of, but it shows the migration.
Please keep that in the podcast. I'd like to give you a list of other things I don't remember for the listeners here.
Work that into the footnotes.
That's right.
All right, let's wrap up with politics. You just wrote an article for the Georgetown Journal of International Relations on the dangers of populism.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit, because I found it very interesting.
Sure. So what is populism? First of all, because it's easy to denigrate Trump, because he's got this highly stylized approach. It's easy to just say, well, you're a buffoon. But there's, I think, a lot there, and it's under this rubric of what is populism?
Because it's working everywhere. We see it at Brexit. We see it in Eastern Europe. In his own way,
Erdogan,
Putin is a populist.
No question. No question. Well, Bernie Sanders, you could say.
Right.
And some elements of Obama, not maybe as orthodox as Trump, but some of what Obama's
I think
doing
a
there.
much more civilized version, at least.
Right. Well, in personal demeanor, no question. But I'm saying, look, there's at least 4 things going on here. What is a populist? 4 things going on. One is it's grievance-based. I can tell you, I want you to vote for me, support me, because I see there are problems out here and I'm as unhappy as you are. So it's grievance-based, which is more potent, I think, of a message, but boy, it makes it harder to govern because you don't actually have a framework for decisions or policy. So one is grievance-based. Two is emotional connectivity. For example, Trump and his rallies.
Yeah, we, us.
Well, when getting cheered back, it's I love you, you love me. So emotional connectivity. Or the story with Abe. Why do you like Abe and not Angela Merkel? Well, she's kind of boring. There's no emotional connectivity there. So it's a projection of the individual. It's a projection of the self. Of Donald Trump presidency is a lot about Donald Trump, right?
Third, all about him.
All about him. Well, and especially if you don't have a policy, if you don't have a compass like Ronald Reagan had. You got to
fill the vacuum somehow.
Right. So it's about me. And Barack Obama certainly had a strong sense of ego about, let me tell you about myself. So the third element of populism, I would say, is it is exculpatory. None of the problems America faces is because of decisions we've made. Other people have done this to us. They've cheated us on trade. They're selling drugs to us. So no American is at fault for having bought drugs, but folks from Mexico, God knows where, are at fault for selling us drugs. Or no American steel worker is at fault because they put their union demands, their wage demands ahead of improvement in efficiencies. It's somebody's cheating us with steel. So we're all victims, and nobody's made a wrong decision in the U.S. And the fourth point of populism is that there are no trade-offs in policies. There's no cost benefit. I mean, if there's a right decision that will get us the right outcome, and that's what government's all about. And the people preceded me were just fools or didn't see this. And if you say, and boy, this was both Trump's trade policy, but it's Obama's health policy, to say, Mr. Obama, we can do this health policy as you want it, but it is going to cost a lot of money. It is going to take people off their current health plans. It's going to create a lot of alienation and ill will. And you're only going to help maybe a few million people, but you're going to hurt maybe 10 times that number. So be very careful about the trade-offs involved. I think Obama's completely in denial about the trade-offs for his health policy, and Trump is completely in denial about trade-offs for his trade policy, to say you're hurting the U.S. economy more than you're helping it.
So if Trump is Juan Perón, which I've always thought, you're a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan Republican.
Yeah.
We both met in the era of Reagan in the early 80s. Yet you were one of the Republican foreign policy officials to sign the letter endorsing Hillary Clinton, which I think was probably a long, drunken day for you, but the choice was there. So I would not characterize you as somebody who's perfectly happy with the status quo of the party. How do we rotate it back?
Yeah.
Because Trumpism long-term, I think, will really damage the country. It already has.
Yeah, I think there's a corrosive element there. Yeah. Listen, there's 3 or so variables I see over the next 2 years. One is the U.S. economy that is expected to soften, not so much in 2019, but in 2020. And that, the incumbent takes the blame for that. So we're going to see an element of that, but we don't know how fast or how deep, but it's going to soften. Secondly, the Mueller report. And again, it might
be very big, could be anticlimactic.
It could be anything. And my take, though, on the outcome is anything short of sort of felonious material, Trump declares victory. If they say you had poor judgment or your
campaign was a bunch of dregs and morons. We already know that.
Yeah. Well, and he also gets to see this guy came after me for 2 years straight, and all he says is I had poor judgment.
Yeah.
To say,
Roger Stones was playing footsie with WikiLeaks and the FSB or whatever.
Exactly.
So Roger Stone's an asshole.
So we don't know. Yeah. We don't know what he's going to say, but I'm putting a big asterisk there. And the other big variable is who will the Democratic nominee be? Because the Democrats just have a preternatural ability to commit suicide.
Yeah,
Let's find the Jeremy Corbyn lookalike guy in this room.
Let's give Trump a candidate he can beat.
Yeah, exactly right. So who knows? Remember, the Democrats moved populists themselves when they stripped out the superdelegates. So they said Trump just runs on passion and emotion. So we want to do the same thing.
My view is without superdelegates, Bernie might have made it.
Yeah.
The math doesn't say that because Hillary had enough delegates, but there was always this kind of collar on Hillary in the media. Well, she got the superdelegates so she can lose that state. He would have had a better momentum argument.
Well, that's true.
Without superdelegates.
That is true. That is true. And by the way, it was the Bernie people who forced the DNC as part of the Perez Keith Ellison package deal to say we're going to strip these superdelegates
I wish
out.
we had Republican superdelegates.
If we had it, we'd have a better...
The smoke-filled room is not a bad thing.
Well, it also, you could synthesize elements. For example, you could say you must have been a registered member of the party for at least a year before you declare president. So
even if you were to paper like state legislatures, where every speaker gets 50 superdelegates. So the professional politicians, some of whom are stone cold crazy wackadoodles, but it would have a little of the crazy
a salutary effect, no doubt. Anyhow, those are the big variables. So it's a little hard to say if in that jigsaw puzzle there's an opening for a primary challenge to Trump or not. I think if you did it right now, I think you're looking at not even clean for Gene 1968. You're looking at not even Pat Buchanan against George H.W.
No,
Bush.
it's a slaughter. I mean, the problem is somebody might be able to go upset him in New Hampshire, but he's not LBJ. He has no shame. He'd just say, they cheated on to South Carolina. I think if he's really evil, he'll start his campaign in South Carolina. You know, why even give him the shot in the one most hostile potential state?
But back to LBJ and the Bush 41, the point is LBJ had the Vietnam War to deal with, which is increasingly a problem. And George H.W. Bush comes into office with a cornerstone pledge of no new taxes, and then he violates the pledge. Fairly or unfairly, that's where he is. So the point is each of these guys have major religious flaws, so to speak, that their own base is unhappy with. And you say, where is Trump? What's happened, I think, regrettably, is what happens in the U.S. is sometimes you get a primary challenge, people don't like you, but more often than not, what happens is that party base shrinks.
Right.
So what's really happened is 10 or 20% of party regulars have said, look, I'm not voting in the primaries.
The very fact that a primary is openly discussed is like an x-ray that you're probably going to lose the general election, regardless of the primary, because it's a symptom of weakness. I don't think Trump has a no new taxes. But the guy who won fundamentally based on being the art of the deal guy who can get stuff done, getting nothing done is kryptonite for him over time. So I'll be interested in to see how his numbers, which have declined a little since the midterms, parties don't like losing, what they look like in 6 months.
Yeah, I agree. It could have a decaying orbit. We haven't really seen it yet, and the calendar isn't going to be that helpful, meaning if it were LBJ and Gene McCarthy, somebody's got to be out running around now saying, I'm ready to nail my flag to the mast. I'm really taking it to this guy, and there's nobody out there right now. So it also
can't be a pearl-clutching campaign about how rude Trump is. It has to be that Trump is anthrax who will give the Democrats complete power, and we're going back to the 70s. You know, it's got to be a pragmatic argument in the party that he didn't keep his promises, not what he says he is, and we're going to get wiped out with this.
I think you're right. If you're simply saying, and by the way, this is what makes me think the Democrats might throw it away. If you're simply saying, I don't like this guy, and he said a tweet last week that was offensive to me, I think you're going to lose if that's your case.
That's cooked in.
That's
as depressing as it is. You know, he's been a horrible president that way. He's weakened the institution, but that's not the voting folks.
The swing voter is not looking at grammar and nouns and tweets and saying, you're right, Trump's got it wrong.
If that were true, the hairstyle would have killed him in the beginning.
That's right.
So we got very little time left. I want to wrap up. Why don't you take a minute of our precious Radio Free GOP podcast time here and plug your excellent book about your dad.
Oh, thanks.
Recently published by the Ohio
University Press. Thanks so much, Mike. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Listen, my dad was combat infantry in World War II, fought in Europe, 84th Division for the combat part of it. So it's a history of the U.S. Army in Europe in World War II, but it's done through a personal framework of a teenager from Ohio who signs up, he enlists, and he goes in as you're supposed to go. But it's all of the weird things that happen to the individual. It's a lot like
because they were kids.
They had no world experience. He'd never been to New York City. He had very limited sort of worldview.
From Ohio, right?
From a small town, Ohio. Plus, don't forget, these are all Great Depression kids. So even if you were intellectually curious or wanted to travel, well, forget it. Your travel is going to be to the county library and, Encyclopedia Britannica. That's your worldview. So it's a real shift for the whole world. By the way, what we see this in the U.S. is sort of Saving Private Ryan or the Ken Burns documentary on the war. I mean, the point is, history nowadays is much more interested in the foot soldier, the teenager. How do you behave in moments of stress? I would say this, the best war stories aren't about the war. If you think of the Caine Mutiny or Mr. Roberts, the best war stories are about human behavior under periods of extreme stress where you cannot control outcomes, you can't control the situation, but can you still act with dignity and you still have a moral code and you still connect with friends and allies and collaborate in an effective way and do your job. So it's a lens into the human condition. It's not this tactics at the Battle of Bulge.
No, it's not. And then we swung left to flank the Germans.
Our tanks had better range.
It's the platoon view.
It's the platoon view. Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and I'll tell you, at this moment, home front to battlefront is something, that sort of reminds you that Americans can pull together. There's a lot of ingenuity. American teenagers can drive you nuts, but they also have incredible creativity and discipline when they need to, and they'll actually do their job. So it's kind of an uplifting book that makes you feel good about sort of where we came from.
So give me the title again and where we can buy it. Probably on Amazon.
Amazon would be the best place. Home Front to Battlefront by Frank Lavin. Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, good. We'll check it out. Thanks. Frank, thanks for being here in the Resistance Podcast. I know you're part of the Army. We're getting back to sanity. I appreciate you spending some time with us on Radio Free GOP.
Thanks, Mike. Onward.
It's number one for rumors and fun. It's Resistance Podcasting, Radio Free GOP.
All right, thank you, Frank Lavin. That was a fun interview. It was good to see Frank. Buy the book. It's good. You will enjoy it. We will be back soon from the undisclosed location with another episode of Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican Revolution. Now I got to pack up the transmitter. It's a little rainy outside. I'll have to make my getaway on slick streets because I hear the siren, the Republican Orthodoxy police. But last time they tried to catch me, they left a note saying keep broadcasting. So the cracks are in the wall. The big wheel is turning. Our long Republican nightmare may be over, and we can build that new Republican Party to beat Democrats and make America stronger and better for everybody. That's the mission, and I believe our time is coming sooner than you may think. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon on Radio Free GOP.
All across the nation, let's put crazy on the run. Tell your friends to listen in. Our podcast will be fun. Radio Free GOP.
This has been Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance, with your host, Mike Murphy.